I'm Billy Hollowell. Welcome to Pure Talk. Thank you so much for tuning in. Tonight we're going to be talking with Dr. Ben Carson about his faith, his incredible career as a neurosurgeon, and his position as Secretary of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Thank you so much for tuning in. Enjoy the interview. Well, Secretary Carson, thank you so much for joining me today. I appreciate it.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
So one of the things about you that I've always loved and admired is your story, this incredible life story that continues to evolve, and you look back at the past and reading about what you went through in your childhood and your schooling and your career as a neurosurgeon and now your career in government. It's fascinating. So I wanted to start with your childhood. Can you just tell me a little bit about your childhood? What was it like?
My early childhood was nice. We lived in one of those little 700 square foot GI homes, and but it had a little yard and everything. I thought it was paradise, quite frankly. But when I was 8 years old, my mother discovered that my father had another family, and of course that resulted in a divorce, and we moved to Boston with some relatives, and that was pretty horrendous. It was a typical tenement. All the things that we're trying to stomp out here at HUD, rats and roaches and mold and,
You lived that. I mean, you went through that as a child, which is another part of your experience in this position at HUD that I think is fascinating, is that few people have gone through something that they're actually trying to alleviate.
Oh, absolutely. And in the afternoons, my mother was out working, my aunt and uncle were out working, so we stayed with another relative in a pretty horrible public housing setting. And there was a lot of violence there, and you had to learn where you could go and where you couldn't go and when you could go and what kind of people to look out for. It was an eye-opening experience. And a couple of my cousins were killed. And which made me believe that I probably wouldn't survive very long. You just had that feeling.
And what is that like, coping with those elements of adjusting to that lifestyle and also going through the emotions of your father and your mom? I mean, what's that like as a kid?
Well, I was the eternal optimist, and I would pray that God would help my parents to get back together. Because back in those days, it wasn't like today, where everybody's divorced.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's the reality now.
Yeah, it wasn't that common in those days. But, the Lord didn't answer that prayer the way I wanted it answered, but in retrospect, I understood why, much later in life, because my father was into drugs and alcohol and women. Nothing wrong with women, but you only have to have one.
Right.
And so, and that probably would not have been a good influence on me. So, my mother tried to take up the slack and worked extraordinarily hard. But, the other thing was I wasn't that great a student in school. And it was okay, no one really thought that much of it, until we moved back to Detroit a couple of years later, and I was like flunking everything. And then it became my mother's list sort of an emergency. What is going on?
Well, and she took pretty extraordinary measures from what I've read.
She did.
What did she do to try to correct this?
Well, the one thing that really stands out in my mind is, I didn't know my timetables. And I didn't think that I really needed to, because they were printed on the back of the notebook, so you could look them up.
You don't need that, right?
Yeah, but she said, you cannot go outside and play until you learn the timetables. And I said, what? For today's time, I would have called social services.
Right.
And they would have taken her away in handcuffs. But, back in those days, that was just, you had to do it. But, with that pressure on me, I learned them pretty quick.
Right, you wanted to go outside and play.
But the most important thing she did is she made us read books, because even though she was a domestic spy, because she was spying on the people whose houses she was cleaning. And she noticed a pattern. They did a lot of reading. and studying and planning, and didn't just sit around watching TV all day. And so she came and imposed that upon us, much to our consternation.
There was less TV.
Yeah, much less TV.
More reading.
But even though I didn't like it very much in the beginning, after a while, I couldn't wait to get into those books. Because, you know, you have to use your imagination when you read. It's much more entertaining than television. But the real offshoot was I was always looking at words. So I learned how to spell. And, you know, you learn grammar and syntax, and, you know, all of my grades start going up. And
so there's a real connection there.
Absolutely.
And you've been passionate, I know, you know, at HUD about this with books. So take me through a little bit of your efforts here.
Yeah, well, you know, there is a program here called Book-Rich Environments, which is done in conjunction with the Department of Education and National Book Foundation, in which we basically want to get books into the hands of a lot of young people who are in disadvantaged situations, because so often, particularly in the places where we have the Title I schools, these kids come from homes with no books or very few books. They go to a school with no library or a poorly supported library. And they're not likely to become readers. And there's a lot of data that indicate that if a child isn't at grade level in reading by the 3rd grade, their chances of being a high school dropout increase dramatically. So you can really change the trajectory of their lives. It's the reason that you know, my wife and I, through the Carson Scholars Fund, put reading rooms in all over the country, mostly in Title I school areas, so that, you know, those kids, first of all, they start doing it because they get points for every book they read, and they can trade them in for prizes, and those prizes look pretty cool.
Fun, though, right?
You know?
It's a fun way to get them going into the.
It doesn't take long before it really changes them.
And you've been through, and again, you've been through it, and I think that's the piece of it that is fascinating to me for your own experience and knowing what your mom did. When did you decide? Like, at what point, right? So your grades start going up. When do you say, maybe I want to be a doctor?
Well, interestingly enough, even when my grades weren't very good, I still thought I wanted to be a doctor. It was really the only thing that interested me, because as a youngster, I used to hear the stories in church and Sabbath school, and they frequently featured missionary doctors going into the deep, dark jungles and, you know, at great personal risk and bringing not only physical but mental and spiritual healing to people. And they just seemed so noble. And I said, that's what I want to do.
So you were exposed to that in the church then?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Absolutely.
Very good.
And in fact, my first public speaking engagement revolved around that, because I was 8 years old, and I was to give the mission story for the 8-year-old division. And my mother said, anybody could read it. You have to give it like you're the missionary in first person. And I did, and they loved it so much, they asked me to take it upstairs and present it to all the adults. This is 8-year-old kid, and all these, and they loved it too. That was my first speaking engagement.
I mean, you went on to have an incredibly successful career as a neurosurgeon. Why did you choose that field? What was it that led you there?
It was actually when I got to medical school. You know, I thought I was going to be a psychiatrist, but when I got there, I started thinking, you know, God gives everybody special gifts and talents, and what did He give you? And I just started analyzing my life, and I realized I had a tremendous amount of eye-hand coordination. In fact, they even named shots after me on table soccer or foosball. I mean, and
I gotta hear those names at some point now. I'm like dying to know.
And you know, I love to dissect things. I had the ability to think in 3 dimensions, which is critical if you're a brain surgeon, because it's just sort of one big amorphous, but there's thousands of different tracks running through it, and you just have to be able to keep in mind, you know, if you're 3 millimeters away from this, what's over here, and
right.
And so, in thinking of all that, I thought, wow, you know, you could probably be a pretty good neurosurgeon. And a lot of people thought that was a weird idea, because at that point there had only ever been 8 black neurosurgeons
Oh, wow.
in the world.
Wow.
And but you know, I really didn't let that deter me, because one of the things that my mother used to always say, you know, in terms of race, she would say, if you walk into an auditorium full of bigoted, racist people, she said, you don't have a problem. They have a problem. Because they're all going to cringe and wonder if you're going to sit next to them, whereas you can go sit anywhere you want. So, so you know, I really never allowed, you know, racial issues to bother me. Just, you know, stay laser focused on what it is that you're trying to do.
And I look back, there's all these different benchmarks in your career. Again, this incredibly successful career. I think 1987, you became the first neurosurgeon to successfully separate conjoined twins at the head. And with that, I guess the question more broadly than just that surgery, how do you, as a person of faith, navigate that reality, and as a doctor, that you're going into a surgery where somebody might not survive? And how do you deal with it when it's not successful?
I always say you do your best and let God do the rest. But, you know, I discovered early on in my neurosurgical career that God was a neurosurgeon, because it was a very complex case, a little boy who was diagnosed with a brainstem tumor that was inoperable. And, you know, they ended up at Hopkins, and the parents had great faith, and they said, the Lord sent us here because we would find a neurosurgeon who could help our son. And I said, there's nothing I can do, or there's nothing anybody can do about this. Somehow, because of their faith, I ended up operating on the kid. And it did turn out to look like a malignant brainstem tumor. I took out as much as I could, closed them up, and, you know, went out and told them, you know, we'll understand it better by and by. Only God knows why these things, you know, all the things we tell people. And they said, thank you, doctor, but the Lord is going to heal our son. And I said, I've never seen people with that kind of faith, fully expecting him to deteriorate and die. But instead, he started getting better. His eyes started looking in the same direction. He started handling his secretions. I said, let's get another scan. And there was still a big, ugly tumor, but there was a little ribbon of tissue at the edge we hadn't been able to see before. And I said, maybe this thing is not in the brainstem, it's outside, and it's just compressing and distorting. I said, maybe we should go back. And they said, by all means. I went back in, and as I pulled away that last layer of tumor, there was the brainstem. Intact, smashed and displaced, but intact. Long story short, he walked out of the hospital, and today is a minister. But
Wow.
After that, you know, first of all, the oncologist came to me. He said, you know, I've never been a believer, but I am now. But it really wasn't even for him. It was for me, because I thought I was doing all this stuff. I said, you know, you came out of inner city Detroit, went to Yale, Michigan. You became director of pediatric neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins at age 33. You're doing all these. You are the man. But then I said, you know what? It's not me.
It's not me. It's not. So God has surprised you in your career then.
Yeah. And I said, Lord, from now on, you be the neurosurgeon, and I'll be the hands.
I love that.
And that's where the term gifted hands came from. It was a gift from him.
I love that. When we actually have that film, the PureFlix platform actually now has that film, and it's something that people are loving, you know, revisiting and watching. When would you say in your life, when you look back, that you fully opened to God? You know, what was that moment for you?
That would be when I was 14, and you know, I had a pretty violent temper, and you know, I would go after people with sticks and baseball bats and hammers and rocks, and when I was 14, you know, I got so angry I tried to stab another youngster, and fortunately he had a large metal belt buckle on under his clothing. The knife struck with such force it broke, and he fled. But I was actually more terrified than he was, because I realized I was trying to kill somebody. And this was after I had turned things around academically. I was a straight A student.
So you had a lot going for you, but
Yeah.
there was still something that was...
But that temper, and I just shut myself up in the bathroom, and I started thinking, I said, I'll never become a doctor with a temper like this. I'll end up in jail, reform school, or the grave. And I just fell on my knees, and I said, Lord, you got to help me. I can't do this. I just no way I'm going to be successful unless you change me. And there was a Bible there, and I picked it up and started reading. And there were all these verses about fools. It seemed like they were all written about me. But then And then there were all these verses about anger too, like Proverbs 19:19. There's no point getting an angry man out of trouble because he's just going to have to do it again. Or Proverbs 16:32. Mightier is the man who can control his temper than the man who can conquer a city. And, I stayed in that bathroom for 3 hours reading and praying, contemplating, and I came to an understanding that to kick down a door or to punch somebody in the face was not a sign of strength, it was a sign of weakness. It meant you could be manipulated by the situation and by other people. And I didn't want that. But I also recognized that it was a sign of selfishness. Because it's always about me, mine, somebody's in my space, I want this, they took my thing. And I said, if you could just learn how to step outside the center of the circle and let it be about somebody else.
Well, it seems like you've done that repeatedly throughout your life.
That was the last day I ever had an outburst.
Wow. And you seem like the calmest person.
Yeah, that's why people can't believe it.
Right.
I can't believe you were like that. But when God changes you, he doesn't just do a paint job. He does it from the inside.
Total renovation, right? So you talked about prayer in that moment and reading the Bible. How has prayer sustained you throughout your career now in government? And what's the day-to-day prayer life like for you?
Well, the day-to-day prayer life is asking for wisdom. I start every day and I end every day reading from the book of Proverbs. Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived. Wise in everything except women. And
a lot of people have that problem in life.
And I pray and I ask God for wisdom. I ask him for direction, and he provides it. Yeah.
And so with that, how do you survive don't laugh at this question, but how do you survive as a Christian in D.C.? It seems tough.
Well, there have been Christians who have survived in the swamp before, but you just have to remember that your job is to do what is right. Not what is politically expedient, not what the newspapers will say, oh, this is wonderful and he's a wonderful person, but what is right. So, in this position, you look at what's been happening to people, large groups of people, for not just decades, for generations of dependency. And some people think it's compassionate just to throw more money at these programs and to pat people on the head and say, there, you poor little thing, I'm going to take care of you. But I don't think that that's what God would consider compassionate. He would consider finding ways to get those people out of poverty, get those people to a place where they can realize their God-given potential. And that's where we're really directing our efforts now.
And I would imagine that opportunity is what attracted you to this position.
That's exactly what it was. That, coupled with the fact that I was very concerned about the direction of our country and what kind of country would be left for my children, for my grandchildren, for all of those who follow us. And it was not looking good. And it's not looking good today. I mean, people are at loggerheads. But I think if we can fix the affordable housing problem and we can help to give people a vision of what life can be, that the American dream is not for somebody else and that nobody else is in control of their lives, and give them the resources that allow them to climb that ladder and become independent, and to teach that to their children so we break these cycles which are unsustainable. But that will also strengthen our country.
Well, and you said vision, and I wanted to ask you about the Envision Center initiative, because that is, so describe it to me. It's interesting to me.
Well, it came from the book of Proverbs, Proverbs 29:18. Without a vision, the people perish. And that's what I saw, a lot of people perishing, not having a vision. I'd go into, development, and I would say to the young people, what do you want to do when you grow up? Mostly you're met with a blank stare. But maybe a basketball player, this or whatever. And I said, we've got to do better than that. So we started thinking, what could we do to actually give people the hand up that they need to envision a different lifestyle. And we have a program called the HUD-VASH program, where HUD provides housing and the VA provides the wraparound services. And through that program, we've reduced veteran homelessness by almost 50%. Now, if you just give a traumatized veteran a house, it doesn't work. If you just give them wraparound services, it doesn't work. But when you do both, it has a profound impact.
Teaching the skills that are needed to actually maintain that house.
Exactly. So we figured the same thing would actually work in terms of getting people out of a dependent situation. And we have to recognize as a nation we only have 330 million people. Sounds like a lot, but compared to China and India, that's only a quarter of what they have. We have to compete with them, which means we need to get bang for the buck. We need to develop our people. We can't afford to just neglect large groups and just let them sit there. So, you know, I feel that that's the mission. We need to change this. We need to change people's thinking. And I realized, I knew from the very beginning that would cause a lot of people to demonize you. There's a strong poverty industry in this country. They're not going to like what you're doing. And then other people, you know, are just fed a lot of propaganda. And quite frankly, our media has forgotten its purpose. You know, it's the only business that's protected by a constitution is the press. And the reason for that is because they were supposed to be the ones who objectively disseminated information to the people, because our country is supposed to be run on the will of the people. But if the people are not getting objective information and people are sitting there trying to manipulate them, it manipulates the whole system. And here we end up in a pretty difficult situation.
Which has been going on for decades. I mean, this has been going on for decades, and we seem to be in a place now where it's come to a head a little bit. Right. And you talked about, you know, the country kind of being in this place, which I want to ask you about after, but it doesn't seem to be helping that dynamic at all. So what is that like for you to navigate? Is that hard when you read headlines, Ben Carson this, or...
Ben Carson hates poor people. Ben Carson doesn't think poor people should be able to live in comfort, that kind of stuff.
Those kinds of things,
which is just, you know, totally the opposite of the truth. It's one of the reasons that I like to go out on the road and talk to groups, because when I can tell them what the actual story is, you know, the reaction that I usually get is, oh, I totally had a different impression of you.
Well, even the Envision Center initiative, a lot of people don't know about that probably because they haven't heard of it, right? They haven't read deep enough. There hasn't been enough maybe.
Right, the mainstream media would never carry a story like that, and particularly the positive effects. But it doesn't matter because, you know, it will take root, it will start to spread, people will see it, it'll take care of itself.
So when you talk about motivation, I mean, for you, your motivation is to help people who have gone through or who are going through things that you faced as a kid, that your family went through.
And I'm also motivated by the fact that, you know, I tend to be a history buff, and I know what the world was like before the United States became a power. It was not a pleasant place. And it will go back to that if we're no longer a power. And if we destroy ourselves, we will no longer be a power.
I wanted to ask you about 2016, your decision to run, you know, for president. I would imagine you had to feel called to do that in some way.
I, you know, spoke at the 2013
I remember that well, yes.
Which I thought was a strange thing when I got the request, because I wasn't aware anyone ever did it twice. And research demonstrated that there was one person who had done it twice, and that was Billy Graham. So I said, wow.
Oh, look at that. That's some good shoes to follow in, right?
So I spoke, but I didn't know what I was going to say. They kept saying, what are you going to say? What are you going to say? We need to be able to tell the president so he can respond. I said, I don't know what I'm going to say.
Can I be honest with you about that? And the last time I interviewed you was actually after that when I was at the Blaze, because I remember watching it, because I had to watch it as the faith editor, and I'm thinking this is probably going to be boring, and I don't mean that in a I watch it every year, I go to it, you know, but I'm like, all right, and then you start talking, I'm like, this is the best thing that I've seen in a long time, because what you're critiquing, essentially, the way the government's operating with the president about this close to you, What was that like for you to do?
Well, it just came out.
So this wasn't some pre-planned sort of, I'm going to do this, you know.
It wasn't to attack anybody.
Right.
It was to talk about what was going on in our country. And, you know, who we are as a people. Are we going to let ourselves be defined by political correctness? Or are we going to let ourselves be defined by the values and principles that made us into a great nation?
Yes.
All of those were the issues. And of course, after the speech, everybody's saying, you got to
It
run
went
for
viral
president.
immediately. I mean, you got to cut this clip. I remember, like, you got to cut this. And I remember watching Obama's face, and that was the interesting part. Like, what's the reaction to this? Because it was an important message. And so that seemed to be sort of the starting point of the move kind of into that political realm. Right. And so feeling called to do that.
Well, I still didn't even feel called to do it at that point, even though everybody was clamoring for me to do it. I just said, if I ignore them, it'll all die down, you know. But it didn't go down. And I was doing a lot of public speaking. There was always people in there with placards and saying, run, Ben, running. And I had over 500,000 petitions in my office. I could barely get in the door.
Wow.
And I finally said, Lord, okay, I hear all this stuff, but you know, it's not something that I particularly feel compelled to do. And I said, you know, people who run for president, they have a Rolodex with all kinds of connections, and they have a big budget, and they have a staff. And I said, I don't have any of that stuff. So there's no way I could run anyway, even if I wanted to. So goodbye.
I'm not doing this. Yeah.
The next thing I knew, there was a complete campaign staff with all kind of endorsements. We were bringing in more money than the RNC. I said, okay.
I guess that's what I got to do.
But, you know, now I can sort of understand it all. I can understand why I needed to go through that in order to be here doing what I'm doing now.
I was going to ask you as a Christian, and I'm glad you said that because, you know, you think, okay, I'm called to do this thing, and you assume maybe this is going to be the thing. Right. The end result is going to be president, right? And then you end up doing something else. And so I was going to say, how do you sort of fit that together? And it sounds like you do.
I do, and then, you know, I go back and I look at the rest of my life, because I remember a few years back I was saying, why am I sitting on the board of directors of the Kellogg Company? Why am I sitting on the board of directors of Costco Wholesale Company? And it wasn't just to make money, it was to learn about large budgets, how to deal with them, managing large groups of people, all the kinds of things that are necessary to run a big agency like this that I wouldn't have known otherwise. So the Lord never asks you to do anything that He doesn't prepare you for.
I love that. Well, two final questions for you. What would you say to a kid who's right now feeling what you were feeling as a kid, sort of feeling trapped maybe?
I would say read. Get books and read, because that's what did it for me. I started reading about doctors and explorers and scientists and philosophers, and one of the things that I began to realize as I read all their stories and their accomplishments is that the person who has the most to do with what happens to you is you. You're the one who makes the decisions. You're the one who decides how much effort to put into something. And, you know, we all have our own spheres of influence. We determine what kind of people we are going to be. Don't let somebody else determine that for you. You see how many people today say, well, I did it because he said this, because she did that.
It's the reality TV culture, you know. It's
you don't let other people define who you are. Right. And that's how you really realize the potential that God has put in you.
Well, and with that, the final question for you is just this kindness crisis that we have going on, where everybody is fighting, and it's intensified, and it's in politics, it's in entertainment, it's everywhere. What, as somebody who everyone always says, Ben Carson is so nice and so kind, and you shared the story about your transformation, what do you say to the culture? What do you say to people?
I say, make a pledge to be nice to everybody for 1 week. I say, surely you can do it for a week, okay? And I say, what that means is no talking about people behind their back for a week. Some people have a stroke, I understand that. It means you see somebody struggling, you help them. You're going to get in the elevator, there's only one spot, let somebody else get on. When you're on the elevator, speak to people. You may have to do CPR, but speak to people. You're going to get in your car, the parking lot is jammed full of people. Well, when you get in your car, you see the three cars behind you waiting for your space. Don't open the glove box and pull down the mirror and start. Just get out of the space. You know, you don't have to revel in your power. But basically, for a week, just try thinking about other people first. And what you'll find is that week changed your life.
I love that. That's good advice. And no mean tweeting and Facebooking in that week, too.
No, you definitely can't do that.
Well, this has been great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you sharing.
It's been
your
a
story.
pleasure. It's been fun. Thank you.
Here's the deal. PureFlix.com has 6,500 titles you can watch right now. That's way too many to show you in just 90 seconds, but you know what? Here we go.
I am the man, you are the dog. I am talking to a dog.
How many times do you know the directions to your house, but you listening to the phone?